Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 International Young Leaders Conference. I am Joyce Davis, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg and Outreach and Opinion Editor for Penn Live and the Patriot News. I am delighted to be here today to welcome you to this annual event, the 2021 International Young Leaders Conference. This event is the culmination of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg's Summer Internship and Enrichment Program. And it has included so many incredible students from our region, high school as well as college. And as many of you know, we are part of a national network of councils known as the World Affairs Councils of America. And in many of our other councils, they are sponsoring similar programs through the summer months. And we have done this program now in our region for 10 years, at the beginning of our founding in 2010. But I'm also delighted to say this summer's program was a collaborative effort between our council as well as Penn Live and the Patriot News. So this is truly an incredible time and an incredible event. And these college and high school students have spent the past weeks organizing today's conference. And we want to make sure we send a special thanks to our sponsors, UPMC and Harrisburg University, for their strong support of not only this conference, but the internship program this summer. Now, our interns have spent these weeks organizing the conference, figuring out the speakers they'd invite, and they titled this Pandemics and Protests. Now, frankly, it's the same title last year's interns chose, because unfortunately, we are still, friends, battling a pandemic. And we're also still battling social injustice at home and abroad, around the world. So you will hear later at the end of the conference from PA Media Group President Kate Barron, but I want to offer words of encouragement to our young leaders on behalf of the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. First of all, I'd like to say how proud we are of the work you have done this summer and of your high achievement to organize a major event, albeit online. Now, in normal times, we would be at Harrisburg University, where we have held this conference in their beautiful state-of-the-art auditorium for at least the past 5 years. But because COVID is still raging among us, both our summer internship and the International Young Leaders Conference has been conducted via Zoom. In many ways, that has allowed an even more enriching experience. Students have been able to speak to internationally acclaimed experts far outside of Pennsylvania. Yes, they did get to talk with Governor Wolf and with State Representatives Jordan Harris and Patty Kim, as well as many experts in global health, international affairs, and social activism. But just yesterday, they spoke to a high official at the US Department of State in a Zoom forum to get an update on US foreign policy in the Middle East, something that would have been far more difficult if we had to travel to Washington, DC. So now I would like to take this opportunity to once again thank and to introduce each of our interns as they take the lead in today's conference. So dear participants, dear audience, dear community, our interns have included Kennedy Holt, graduate of Harrisburg High, who's headed to Shippensburg University. Ariana Jenna, Lebanon Valley College. Lindsay Becker, Penn State University. Mackenzie Kuhn, just graduated from Penn State Harrisburg. Camera Bailey, Cumberland Valley High School. Aaron Joseph, Cumberland Valley. Arushi Dedya, Cumberland Valley. Anisha Parida, Manheim Township. Mega Shamugan, Cumberland Valley. Anthony Carter, the Haverford School. Xavier Humphrey, Susquehanna Township High School. And finally, our latest addition, Depti Rao, Cumberland Valley High School. Friends, these are truly the next generation of world leaders. Once again, I thank our board of directors and our sponsors for making such an event possible. And now I have the distinct pleasure of turning it over to Anisha and our interns who will take the show on the road. Go, Anisha.
Welcome, everyone. The interns of the World Affairs Council have been working tirelessly to create the 2021 International Young Leaders Conference. Constructing this conference over the internet due to COVID-19 has provided its challenges while also presenting areas of new knowledge for all of us to explore. Whether it was over Zoom or email, the interns were consistently trying to improve today's conference to make it the best experience for everyone involved. For this reason, the conference will include panels on the future of COVID, protests, and global issues. In between the panels, there will be an opportunity to play games ranging from Jeopardy to Guess That Flag. Hopefully, this experience will provide you with an opportunity to reflect and grow. Also, to our audiences in the webinar, if you have any questions throughout the panel and conference, just type your question in the Q&A box and we will answer and discuss your question after the directed questions to our speakers. For our Facebook Live viewers, feel free to type your message in the live chat. Now, introducing our first panel is Mega Shanmugam.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our conference. In this panel, we'll be discussing the future of COVID, mental health, and vaccines. Throughout this panel, the interns and I will be asking the pressing questions and myths regarding COVID-19 and the impact it will have on our future. To help us understand more about the coronavirus, we'll be having 5 distinguished experts to speak with us today to answer and inform us about all of the concerns and questions we have about COVID-19. The following speakers that will be featured in the COVID segment are David Saunders, who's the Director Office of Health Equity at Pennsylvania Department of Health and has taken on the massive task of developing a collective response to COVID-19 and the implications of the pandemic on vulnerable populations in the Commonwealth. Next, we have Dr. Melissa Brown, who's a psychologist at UPMC and uses an integrative approach in her practice to treat her clients. After that, we have Dr. Suresh Kuchipudi, who's a clinical professor and serves as the Associate Director of Animal Diagnostic Laboratory. He's also the head of microbiology, overseeing bacteriology, virology, serology, and molecular diagnostics units of the ADL at Penn State University. Then we have Professor Sergey Pond. He's a biology professor at Temple University and has done various researches on biology. And finally, we have Dr. Nirmal Joshi, who's an internal medicine and infectious disease physician and is an accomplished physician leader. He currently serves as the president of the Joshi Health Foundation, which is a non-profitable charitable foundation in Mechanicsburg, PA, that provides free healthcare to those with limited or no ability to pay. Now we'll be moving on to our questions. The first question will be from Xavier to Dr. Joshi.
Good afternoon, Dr. Joshi. Could you explain why the virus is called COVID-19?
I'm sorry, I was finding it hard to hear you for a little bit. Can you please repeat your question and then I'll go ahead and get started. I was having some technical difficulties here.
Yes, I can, and that's fine. Good afternoon. Could you explain why the virus is called COVID-19?
Sure. So COVID-19, as most of you will remember in vivid detail, was in somewhere around November, December timeframe, right around December, I recall, of 2019, when following an outbreak of what seemed at the time to be a weird respiratory disease in Wuhan, China, was eventually found to be a virus. And at the time, because it was first kind of identified, if you will, or the disease was first identified in 2019, and it was similar to a coronavirus, of which there are numerous that we already knew at the time, causing relatively minor respiratory diseases. That it was a newer type of a coronavirus, so we called it a novel coronavirus. So the disease caused by that, so the CO stands for the coronavirus, and then obviously the VID-19 stands for disease, viral disease discovered in 2019. So when you put all that together, that stands for COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Our next question will be from Anisha to Dr. Kuchipudi.
Hi, Dr. Kuchipudi. Thank you for coming to speak with us today. My question is, what is the state of science right now? And do you think we're still in the middle of a pandemic? So where do you stand in regards to COVID-19 and its relevance?
Good afternoon. Thanks, Anisha, for the question. So the question is really complicated and packed with a lot of information. So I'll try to be brief and give you some insights into what we understand. So the first part is that when would be the end of the pandemic? Or are we getting closer to the end of the pandemic? And the honest answer is we don't know yet. And the reason is that, as we all know, there are multiple variants of the virus circulating and will continue to emerge. And the critical aspect is that most people, if not everybody, should get vaccinated. So once everybody is vaccinated, and that's when we will be in a position to determine when the pandemic would end. With regards to your other part of the question about the state of the art and what we are learning about the virus, since early 2020, when we first started understanding the virus, in the past year and a half, we as a scientific community made a significant advance in understanding of the virus. So now we know quite a bit about the biology of the virus, and there are incredibly safe and effective vaccines already developed and currently being used. That is an incredible achievement from a scientific standpoint, which never happened in the history. So that is a biggest achievement. And I think it's important to recognize that although the vaccines are developed in such a short span of time, but the enabling knowledge was the decades of scientific research that helped us to do expeditiously these vaccines. So that is an important thing. And the other major development is understanding of the genome or genetics of the virus. So we have now what is called a whole genome sequencing technology widely available. So for the first time, we have thousands and thousands of virus sequences publicly available. So we could assess how the virus is evolving and how virus is spreading. So these are all the great advances in science that we have been able to make. But the important aspect is that the public health is not just the scientific advancement, but the implementation of it. So again, through this forum, I would urge everyone who is listening and all the young leaders to be the advocates for vaccination. And the only way we can get to the end of this pandemic is encouraging everybody to get vaccinated. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Puchipudi. That's definitely one of the main things that we've been trying to tell people: get vaccinated, because during this time, if we want to get past this virus, we have to get vaccinated. So thank you very much. Our next question will be from Xavier to Dr. Brown.
Good afternoon, Dr. Brown. During the COVID pandemic, we have seen a rise in mental health issues leading to a crisis. Do you think that this mental health crisis was caused by COVID-19 and its own issue, or a crisis that's been ongoing but just exacerbated by COVID-19?
That's a great question. I think that the answer mainly lies in that we've had a mental health crisis for some time. And, unfortunately, COVID has certainly highlighted the need for mental health, and it just exacerbated the crisis that currently exists. It has highlighted certainly the inability for certain populations to access care, the difficulty in accessing care in and of itself, the arduous process, as well as unfortunately just the lack of providers to ensure that everybody that needs to have some type of mental health treatment is able to get that, not having enough providers. So in summary, yes, the unfortunately, COVID has exacerbated the mental health crisis that already exists, and our system is really struggling to keep up. We're doing the best we can, but certainly it's still not enough.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Our next question will be from Ariana to Dr. Joshi.
Hello, Dr. Joshi. Thank you so much for being here today. I was wondering if the vaccines that we have currently are holding up against Delta, and why is it that we are seeing people who are fully vaccinated still getting sick at times?
Sure. So I think that by and large, I think the currently available vaccines, as Dr. Kuchipudi was making, in his comments earlier on, they are, in my mind, they are one of the most remarkable discoveries of our generation. They really are. I mean, if you think about it, going back, and all of us, and some of us who grew up in, including me, who grew up in India, have seen the beginning, the evolution, and eventually the end of diseases such as smallpox, for example, right, by effective vaccination strategies. We've also seen significant containment and ultimate elimination in many countries of polio, as an example. Vaccinations directed at those viruses took years and years to develop and ultimately implement across vast populations of people to be able to get people adequately vaccinated. Not just vaccinated, but the development process took years. And here we have literally a year after the raging pandemic, one of the worst things we've ever seen. A year after that, science comes along, and to Suresh's earlier point, after decades of kind of background work that went on in related fields, science puts it together. Everyone across the country comes together. Research and industry comes together and creates tests in tens of thousands of people, tests the vaccines and puts them out for commercial production, and then in people's arms. I mean, it is just a remarkable thing. And at the end of that, to see a certain proportion of the population go, I'm not sure, is while to some extent understandable, and we'll get more into that, coming up. But the fact is that process, and ultimately the vaccines being the currently available, the two most common ones in this country being those manufactured by Pfizer and Moderna, and certainly the third one by Johnson & Johnson as well, but certainly the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for sure, the level of efficacy being of the order of in the 90% to prevent disease, symptomatic COVID disease, is one of the most remarkable things for me as an infectious disease doctor, is one of the most remarkable things I've seen in my lifetime, and we probably will see in our lifetime. I think many people don't recognize that in the community because a lot of time is spent in talking about the lower than being hit by lightning chance of a potential side effect that people get all hung up on. But what they forget is the number of lives that it's changing. So the short answer is the currently available vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna in particular, remarkably high efficacy rates. By way of comparison, vaccines such as pneumococcal vaccine for pneumococcal disease, pneumonia, right? 55 to 60% efficacy in the elderly. And we go out in public health campaigns trying to get that vaccine in people's arms. And here we have a vaccine against a life-threatening illness that has a 93 to 95% efficacy and a near 100% efficacy for getting one into the hospital or severely ill, is to me nothing short of remarkable. So that's one. To your question, against that backdrop, to your question of are they holding up against the Delta variant? Certainly both Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, I think, are holding up superbly well against the Delta variant. Their efficacy may be slightly lower to prevent symptomatic disease, period, slightly lower. However, when it comes to life-threatening illness, hospitalizations, and death, remains extraordinarily high, and I believe continues to be not a cause for concern. Now, the Delta variant is a cause for serious concern in many other ways, okay? But vaccine efficacy-wise, I think it's holding up extremely well.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. And I think that's one of the biggest things people are not realizing is that people think, a lot of people with these days still getting the virus while they're vaccinated think, oh, what's the point of the vaccine? But without the vaccine, their life would be at severe risk. So it's very important to get vaccinated at this point because having the vaccine can prevent you from dying. It reduces the symptoms. So I think that's one of the main things we want to inform people, get vaccinated. Our next question is from Anisha to Professor Pond.
Good afternoon, Professor Pond. My question is, do you think that there are potential long-term health problems that could arise from the vaccine or other variants, for example, developing asthma after contracting the virus?
Oh, thank you for your question. I'm not an infectious disease doctor. I'm an evolutionary biologist and a data scientist, so I'm more equipped to speak about the virus side of the story. So I can tell you a little bit about what we've seen. So SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, is an RNA virus. RNA viruses have an intrinsic capacity of rapid mutation. It's true of all viruses in that family. So other examples would be like HIV, hepatitis C, and influenza A and B viruses. What that means is that as they circulate through the population, they will continue accumulating genetic variants. And we've seen this sort of with unprecedented resolution in this pandemic, because this is what I like to call the first real-time genomics pandemic. We have collected as a scientific and public health community now over 2.5 million full genomes of the virus. To give you a sense of how quickly this happened, it took us 30 years to collect 1 million genomes of HIV, which is obviously a continued health problem in its own right, and has been subject of very intensive study. So this degree of resolution enables us to watch pretty much in real time what the virus is doing. But historically, what happens is that viruses are ancient organisms. For example, coronaviruses, we've estimated a couple of years ago that they're tens of millions of years old. So they've been co-circulating with mammalian species pretty much since the dawn of mammals, which means that they are very well adapted to doing what they do. So they infect hosts, new hosts, and then as they go through the population, they have adaptive mechanisms which allows them to sort of stay, in some cases, ahead of, let's say, our immune responses, or the best thing we can do. Saving grace, I think, for us is that because we had such a rapid response, the virus had very little lead time to create a whole lot of genetic diversity. So basically, the early vaccines were designed to work against the strain that was effective more or less against everything else that you would likely expose it to. That's not the case, for example, for influenza, which is very genetically diverse. This is not the case for HIV, which is even more genetically diverse. So what I see happening in the future, as far as side effects from vaccines, I think and long-term health complications, this is way too early to tell. I mean, all the data at the moment are quite encouraging. But obviously you have to, wait and learn. There's a lot of unknowns. It's a very difficult question. What we do know about, vaccine responses is there's a lot of individual level variability. And it typically takes, years and possibly decades to dig all the way down to understand, what happens and when it happens. And if you're talking about long-term diseases, obviously this requires significant follow-up to get to the point where we can measure what's going on. So the sort of encouraging thing is that we have, as Dr. Joshi mentioned, this is sort of an unprecedented speed of vaccine development. The new delivery technology, the mRNA delivery technology, allows you to produce vaccines very quickly and also change the immunogen, so the payload of the vaccine very quickly. This, for example, was not the case with influenza vaccines. So what this means is that we can very rapidly design and design new vaccines to respond to what the virus is doing. If you haven't, read anything about this, I strongly would encourage you. There's some great reviews, that have recently come out from immunologists and folks that have been doing vaccine research in sort of complicated pathogens like HIV. You can design sort of a universal vaccine, which takes this view that instead of targeting what is circulating today, we can try to design a vaccine that is going to be effective against things that we're likely to see in the future. So make it very difficult for the virus to escape. And I think this brings about 20 years worth of research in, say, HIV vaccinology, influenza vaccinology. So this is all your classical science pyramid where we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and we're never starting from scratch. We're always just, taking everything that's being developed for other diseases and translating it to this setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pond. Our next question will be from Ariana to Mr. Saunders.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders, for being here. So as your role in really helping Pennsylvania out and with this pandemic, I wanted to ask you, what role did politics play throughout the pandemic, especially in Pennsylvania, and what could have Pennsylvania done better?
Interesting. As a public health official, it would be inappropriate for me to respond directly to that question. So I apologize for that. I will say this, that politics tend to dictate where resources are allocated. Politics dictate our policies and practices. So folks like myself that are public servants are mandated to do certain things and are restricted to do certain things and are provided allocated resources to implement public health measures. And again, in many cases, that is dictated by politics. Something for you all to take a peek at, if you have not heard of the political determinants of health, you might want to peek at that. Many people have seen information relative to the social determinants of health, but what we're finding is that a lot of what a person like myself can do is really dictated by those that are in power. So I can't respond directly to what's happening here in Pennsylvania, but I'm sure you folks can kind of read between the lines as to what's happening both on a national level as well as here within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saunders. Our next question is from Xavier to all the panelists who can answer this.
How has social media contributed to disinformation related to COVID-19 and vaccines throughout the pandemic? Yeah.
I'll jump in there. That I can answer. I guess what I've seen, social media moves so fast, and it changes so much. So if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, and even TikTok and Facebook, depending upon who you follow, may sway you in your thinking. What we encourage is for people to go to credible sources. So here in Pennsylvania, if you go to our website or our Department of Health website, you're always going to get credible information. Same thing with CDC and other federal websites. So we always encourage students and others to go there, and we try and do our best to keep that information updated. But social media, can be a benefit, but it also can be a detriment and an impediment if the misinformation is believed and acted upon.
I would also add from the psychological end, what people often do, particularly with social media, is what's called confirmation bias. So they are seeking out information that confirms their current belief that they hold. So if they want to confirm that the vaccine is bad, they often will follow or seek out information that supports that thought that they had. This is a psychological term, well known and well understood. So, and we know it's hard sometimes to challenge that analytic thought and to find information. So, and as Mr. Saunders said, just kind of that rapid changing information and people feeling frustrated by the evolution, if you will, of us treating the coronavirus and what needed to be done as we learned more information, because it was so novel and new to us. And that was psychologically, that created some doubt for many people, which all of that together and combined, really tugged at everybody and really created some struggles for some people. So that's the psychological end.
Yeah, if I could also just add a general broad comment to that. One thing we all must recognize is that the social media is what the way we communicate now. Whether we like it or not, the incredible difference with social media compared to the other traditional media is the engagement that people do. So you are responding, acting real time to a message that is shared. So you are either liking it, sharing it. So the power of social media to influence on people's behavior is really tremendous. And that's why all businesses and everybody now, they spend significant amount of resources in also social media marketing. So with that in mind, we also should know now that whatever is put on social media is not verified or peer reviewed, as Mr. Saunders mentioned earlier. For example, scientific information or public health information in certain reputed sources are verified or peer reviewed. And that is where I think people need to know that social media, as powerful as it is, these are all could be opinions of some individuals, and most of the times are not probably backed up by any scientific basis. So that's where when it comes to health information or scientific information, social media is not the source to get authenticated information. And that distinction has to be made clearly. Otherwise, then you then get into a situation where the real information and misinformation get all mixed up, and there is no real way to distinguish between them.
There is I think there is a saying out there that while Mr. Saunders can't talk about politics, we certainly can. I guess there is a saying in politics, if someone says something and it's not rebutted, that sort of stands as truth, right? So similarly in social media, I believe that people like us who are any one of us on this panel today who are in some way, shape, or form inherently analytical thinkers, whether we are scientists, whether we are physicians, whether we are students, we're analytic thinkers at heart, at our core. And it's our responsibility almost, to Suresh's point, social media is here and real. You can complain however much you want about it. That's the way people communicate, right? So we might as well be part of it and rebut things that we believe are inappropriate, wrong, scientifically not valid, or what have you. That's our obligation. It's not to not show up there, but rather to show up there in a credible fashion, whether it be our organizations, whether it be ourselves as people, as responsible citizens. We need to show up there and say something that if it means counteracting news that's inappropriate or wrong or downright false, it's our moral obligation to intervene and say something.
The other sort of side of this that I would like to mention is, as a scientist, for example, I mean, I don't spend much time on social media. I don't find it productive, but as far as just the volume of information that has been generated in the course of this pandemic is stunning. I mean, the National Library of Medicine recently indexed 150,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers and preprints on COVID. So it is impossible for any one person or even any one group to honestly say that they follow on the literature. So you basically have to be very careful about interpreting what's out there, because the volume is amazing, and it is not, we're not capable as individuals of dealing with this amount of information. There is also this unfortunate, I think, expectation that, even as scientists, one of the things that you realize really early on is that you should always be open to revising your views as new data come in. There's always a great degree of uncertainty, especially in these very complex problems. And if people want a simple answer, a lot of times you can't give a simple answer because it is not the right thing to do. We don't have the data. So I think one of the worst, outcomes of this echo chamber and reinforcement is that people have kind of gelled onto these very, very simple black and white alternatives, where in fact, in many cases, there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of like individual level of variation that you need to consider. But, just as a key point I want to make is there's so much out there, and there's so much conflicting data in peer-reviewed scientific literature that it's even difficult for an expert in a small domain to exactly pin down what is the consensus, because it's always changing. It's coming at a very rapid pace, and this is not something that we've dealt with ever. So there's a lot of, new ground being broken everywhere, good and bad.
All right, thank you everyone for answering that. It's definitely eye-opening, and definitely these days, social media plays a huge impact. It's our only way of communication with not being able to see each other, and with social media, with so many people access to it, there's so much false information going through, like everyone said, and the mental impact it has, and it's weighing people down. So thank you for answering that. Now we'll be taking questions from our participants and the attendees here. So our first question is actually from Ms. Davis. Why are we hearing so many health professionals aren't getting vaccinated? And anyone can answer this, any of our speakers here.
So I can certainly take a stab at it. I think that quite honestly, health professionals represent a segment of our society, and I'm finding, for example, I can certainly speak for my institution and our hospital where I work, is that I find almost an identical viewpoint or a collective group of viewpoints that we find from health professionals that we find from the community at large. Now, within health professionals, it's a very diverse, broad group of people. So for example, within physicians, you will find in higher vaccination rates compared to, let's say, janitorial staff in a healthcare setting, or similarly among nursing staff, you will find a very high degree of vaccination, because both groups of individuals are seeing frontline care evolve in front of their eyes, number one. And secondly, they have access to the same evidence-based information that they can look at in a nuanced way and make an informed decision. On the other hand, other healthcare professionals are perhaps more representative of the society at large, and they have behaved in general like the society at large. Good, bad, or indifferent is not for me to judge, but they have behaved similar to the society at large. It's very frustrating for those of us who are passionate advocates of and evidence-based advocates, I might add, of vaccination and prevention of infectious disease in general. But that's really at the heart of it, that the healthcare community is diverse, and many of them are very similar to the community at large.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Another follow-up question from Ms. Davis was that if you need it, why hasn't the FDA approved the vaccine to resolve any questions about its safety?
Yeah, I don't know if one of the other panelists wants to take that, Suresh or someone else. I can certainly take a stab at it, but I'd love to have someone else talk through that.
Maybe I can address that. So I think the point is the unprecedented need, and what we need to recognize is that we are still in the middle of a global pandemic that we have not seen for a century. So the processes and approvals have been designed for the normal course of action. So FDA has a set certain guidelines that will go through for an approval of a vaccine or a biologic, which typically takes a long time. And since we needed a vaccine in the middle of a pandemic, so what they have done is they have given the emergency use authorization. So which means that it is no less rigorous process. I think the people need to know the term is different because it is not the approval process, but an emergency use authorization based on the need. But they have taken all the necessary data to assess its safety, efficacy, and potency. So, but I do understand that it's a nuance and people use this term, so it's not fully approved, hence it is experimental. I think the fact that people need to know is that the emergency use authorization is also a rigorous process that takes into all the data into account. And then I hope that soon the approval process will also go through, but it is just the policies and processes that takes time, cannot be done in a short span of time, and that's the delay.
Thank you, Dr. Kochwitty. Our next question from our attendees is from Michelle, who asked, should people be more concerned with long COVID symptoms or should they get vaccinated? So that they should get vaccinated.
Yeah, I can certainly take that. I mean, Yes, yes, and yes. Please get vaccinated for a zillion reasons, one of which is long COVID. So, many patients have been left with debilitating illness following COVID, and it's a shame. I mean, there are now long COVID clinics in many institutions that are specifically catering to COVID symptoms that linger on for extended periods of time. One among many of these, they range from neurologic symptoms to respiratory symptoms to neuropathic symptoms to just about any body system that you can think of. One of the worst ones that I have seen have been respiratory illnesses, meaning people have been left with debilitating shortness of breath for extended periods of time. That's so debilitating, it's hard to watch, particularly when you see a 42-year-old, a 38-year-old, a 52-year-old, relatively young individuals, not young by student standards, but young by our standards, that young folks who are left with such severe, who are otherwise entirely healthy, had remarkably normal immune systems. In fact, some of those people have been left with pretty remarkable long-term consequences that in many instances, we don't know which direction they will go, and the future, similar to what one of the other panelists noted earlier, just because we don't know the long-term outcomes quite yet, that it's just unknown whether some of these people will be left with what appears to be a chronic interstitial lung disease type process, which is most of us who've seen that in the non-COVID context for years and years. It's very, very sad to see and very difficult to watch when you have a loved one go through that. Whether or not people will be left with that, or there will be a slow recovery over years or months, following COVID, we just don't know. And there are currently numerous research studies going on with specific drug therapies, other therapies with long COVID. So long-winded way of saying that's actually, even in some instances, even more scary than passing away, right? Because you're left with such debilitating symptoms that you deal with on a daily basis. So the answer is yes, that is one among a litany of reasons why people should get vaccinated.
If I may just add one more point to that. So one thing is that the long-term consequence of COVID or the vaccines, when you think long-term, 10 years, we're not quite there, so we don't know. But what we do know is that in the past year and a half, as Dr. Joshi has clearly indicated, we know very well that COVID also causes a wide ranging of long-term illnesses in people. So in terms of risk aversion, while we don't know what is going to happen after 10 years, but we now know that COVID can cause this long-term illnesses in many people. So in terms of risk assessment, it is pretty clear that so far we have not seen any major side effects of vaccination, but we do know that COVID causes a whole host of pathologies and side effects. So, the data is very clear which choice people have to make if they're really looking at the risk assessment and then how best they want to mitigate the risk.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi and Dr. Kuchipudi. Our next question from the attendees is that should hospitals/doctors be allowed to not treat people if they get sick from COVID if that person refused to get vaccinated, have a health or other precluding reasons they couldn't get vaccinated?
Yeah, the answer is no. So, this one is one of the more straightforward ones in ethics, as opposed to a complex ethical question. This is a pretty straightforward ethical answer, which is no. You don't refuse care to anyone, regardless of any belief, anything. You care for people when they're sick. It's as basic as that with any, and I think any healthcare professional worth their salt would say the exact same thing. And I think, but it's worth explaining why, which is that when healthcare professionals begin to pass judgment, it's just a bad place to be, right? Judgment meaning that would I not take care of an IV drug abuser if they developed endocarditis, as an example, because they could have avoided using IV drugs? Would I stop treating people with chronic lung disease because they smoked most of their life? They made a choice to smoke. They didn't have to. that's a judgment, right? And healthcare professionals don't work on judgment. They believe in compassion, they believe in care, and they believe in offering that care at the bedside to the very best of their ability to everyone who seeks that care, regardless of their backgrounds, their origin, their ability to pay, their ability to or their belief systems. There are people who we take care of who have very different belief systems than ours, that have prejudices and biases that are different than ours. But the care at the bedside remains constant.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Our next question from our attendees was asking, are we being responsible if we facilitate gathering for purposes of protest? Does or does not our responsibility to halt mounting national and global crisis outweigh our responsibility to demonstrate leadership in responding to the pandemic?
I'll jump in. It's a difficult choice, huh? You know, there's so many things going on. I know we're so focused in on COVID-19, but there are other things going on in the world. And one doesn't, in my opinion, this is only my opinion, doesn't supersede the other. I would just encourage all those that might gather in large groups if they feel the necessity to do so. Of course, to be masked and as much as possible social distance. It's a difficult decision to make, and it's a personal choice, obviously.
Yeah, I can give my perspective as a virologist without going into the reasons of why people gather or is it right or wrong. It's all questions about the political position or their belief system. But virus doesn't really care why people gather. Virus will transmit among groups of people when they gather. So I think the important aspect is to know that virus, if there is any opportunity to transmit or spread among people, it will. And the more the virus spreads, the more it evolves. As Professor Pond mentioned, it's an RNA virus. It's inherently able to change. So the key aspect is that whatever the reason that might be, we need to know that any gathering in the face of the pandemic without appropriate mitigation always runs the risk of facilitating the transmission. So that is an important aspect, that we need to separate the science and the facts from our political beliefs and other, which are also important. But I think that we need to be able to distinguish. The reason doesn't really matter, but the conditions could always facilitate the virus transmission.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders and Dr. Kuchipudi. There's actually another question to Mr. Saunders asking, many vaccines are required to attend school in PA. Why can't we simply add COVID-19 to the list for students 12 plus?
It actually goes back to the first question I was asked as it relates to politics, but also jurisdiction. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you have over 2,500 school districts. And to this point, the governor of Pennsylvania is not dictating, not providing any mandates. So each school district is in a position to make their own decision. That is the choice that the governor has made. So that's really why it can't be uniformed across the Commonwealth, because each school district is right now in a position to make their own choices.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Mackenzie has asked, to any of the panelists, should institutions and businesses require proof of vaccination or a negative test result to attend?
Yeah, I think that these two questions, the previous one and this one, are actually somewhat related, which is that if you look at across the boards, some of the tensions between whether it be political parties, political points of view, or between honestly good people differing with each other, it has to do with two fundamental things, because those two things intersect, which is freedom in general, which we as a country, as a collective country, as a population, as a civilization in this country at least, we value more than perhaps anything, right? Is freedom. Now, public health, when your own freedom colludes or intersects with what can be perceived as a collective good, is when those two intersecting points, when they're in competition with each other, which one trumps, is a question that is at the heart of many of the differences of opinion when it comes to mandates, when it comes to and the question really inherently being that mandates inherently, they're very good on one end, where you say the collective good, public health good, trumps everything else. And there are laws in the country that go back in infectious diseases. So for example, if in the context of tuberculosis and other contexts, there are laws in the country that say, if you decide to jeopardize public good, you can be arrested, you can be, you can be forced to do X or Y, be isolated and so on. However, when suddenly that same thing began to get extrapolated to large populations of people, that's where the intersections begin to happen between personal freedom and the collective good. And things such as requiring passports, vaccine passports, and so on, becomes essentially a combination of the primary science and very active politics, and in politics, those two things have varying degrees of importance, if you will, in the minds of people who are politically inclined towards one direction or another, which is why these questions are so difficult. They're such a personal question, and yet we as a society have had to make active decisions on the fly because public good is potentially at stake. So the restaurant question is a classic example of that. On the one hand, it makes common sense for areas where there are congregations to require vaccination, solid science to back it up, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have the genuine competing interest of people being able to make a living, folks where there's personal freedom, and then there are all kinds of potential exceptions, the logistical difficulty of implementing a complex thing such as that. So that's why the answer is not, yep, go make it happen, or no, don't go make it happen.
If I may add, there is, just to give you a sense, this is, I think, one of the cases where people wish to have a simple solution, the one size fits all, but I don't think it's possible. And let me give you two examples. For example, if you had the vaccine itself is an indication, but you don't care about the vaccine. You care about whether or not the individual is able to resist infection by SARS-CoV-2 or transmit. So what you really want is one of the measures for this would be neutralizing antibody titers. So does this person have antibodies that neutralize infection? Doesn't matter how they arose. How do you deal with people that had COVID-19 and have titers that are as good or better than the vaccine? Why do they need a vaccine if they already have the titers? Not saying this is I don't have a policy advice for you, but that's something to consider. Another possibility is that there's going to be an expiration date on all of this, because what we do know from vaccinology is that antibody responses for certain diseases, especially respiratory viruses, once you have a vaccine, they decay over time. Certain other responses persist longer. I mean, actually some fascinating studies that came out after COVID-19 hit, where people looked at SARS-CoV-1, which was a related but different virus that had a smaller scale outbreak in 2003 and 2004. And certain types of immune responses persist 15 years later, but certain go away in 6 months. So if you have a vaccine today, do you know that you're still protected a year from now? And the question is, these are all scientifically complicated, nonlinear quantities that you can't just extrapolate and say, everybody who had a vaccine today is fully protected 3 months from now, 6 months from now, 18 months from now. We simply don't have the data for this. So which means that this is a more complex situation with a lot of variables and shades of gray. And this is, again, just my view as a scientist. We need to have, if you want people to follow on mandates, you have to convince them, right? You want to have people take that decision on their own. That way you don't need a mandate. And one way to convince people to do this is give them the information and the honest risk assessment and everything else that goes with it, so they can themselves decide this. There's no better way to persuade somebody than to convince them that that was their own idea. So I think, that's sort of where you got to go, in my opinion.
Something else I've seen is that, that some organizational heads, if you will, are making it difficult if you are not vaccinated. So you may have seen what's happening in New York. New York City is, in order for you, if I'm getting this right, in order for you to enter into a restaurant, you now have to, or you will have to, show proof that you've been vaccinated. If you look in the sports world, in the NFL, they've basically segmented it. If you're vaccinated, you don't have to get tested as much. You can meet in person during training camp. Where if you are not vaccinated, you have to get tested on a more regular basis. You're segregated from your teammates. So in some cases, organizations or and political entities are basically making policies or putting policies in place that make it difficult for you to not be vaccinated. It makes it inconvenient for you to not be vaccinated. So we'll see what happens with that.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, Professor Pond, and Mr. Saunders. Now we'll be moving on to our interns questions. The first question will be asked by Ariana to Dr. Brown.
Dr. Brown, I think a lot of the time when we talk about COVID, we don't talk about mental health. And of course, the sickness is a huge part of it, but also just the effect that this has had is going to be, we've already seen so many effects of it that are incredible to see, not in a positive way, but it's really astounding. And one thing that I would want to ask is, what impact have we seen on the mental health, especially of elderly in mental health or in nursing homes and all of that? And then kind of along with that, our youth, babies being raised and, children that have gotten pulled out of school. What are the kind of effects on, our youngest and oldest members of our population?
Yeah, that's a great question. And some of what the initial research coming out that's being conducted is indicating that, as we all have experienced, as a psychologist are calling this collective trauma, that first year of COVID, the isolation, the mask wearing, the fear, the concern, the sickness, the deaths that have happened. We are looking at a certain population that is our elderly population that, not sure how many years they might have left in their life and have lost significant amount of time comparative to the relative number of years that they have not been able to be with loved ones in person or see them, and just overall that importance of that physical touch that goes with being in a human relationship with her, mother, daughter, grandma, granddaughter, etc. And our younger population too, just generally speaking, the whole reason for living, if you will, is social interactions and social engagement. So a number of people, and it's hard for us adults to sometimes think about the importance of those social interactions, but really that is the job of a teenager, of an adolescent, of a toddler, is to have these social interactions, to learn and grow and develop an understanding of the world. So as time marches on, hopefully with being able to adapt, and most people are learning to do that, we can certainly develop, interventions and help people manage the trauma or the stress that they've experienced as a result of COVID. And, also this, and that goes with our elderly too, and also caregivers. I think we're going to see a generation where, people have had to deal with multiple deaths, because of COVID and this collective mourning that people are experiencing that, has made it difficult to continue to recover because, we are still in the midst of all of this and still talking about it and really not able to take a big, deep breath at this point. We're still taking those shallow breaths as we manage. So the positive we have been able to highlight the importance of self-care and what that looks like. It's not necessarily just spending the day at the spa, but it is that everyday active participation in your life of taking care of your needs as well as those that you love and care about. And so, hopefully we can continue this conversation and it doesn't just fall by the wayside, but we can recognize just that continued importance of mental health is health and it is part of our overall health and people are accessing that service.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. I think that's one of the biggest things people tend to forget. We always talk about the virus, but there's so many side effects with the mental aspect, and the mental aspect affects everyone. When people get COVID, it's the COVID patients that are hurting. But when it comes to like the whole pandemic, the mental aspect is huge, whether it's from kids to elderly people. Like these days, like we're all missing on our childhood, like my high school days. Like I always tell my dad, I'm like, oh man, I missed my sophomore year. And then that's for everyone. And I see kids going around, and some of the kids, there's this kid like, I don't have any friends because he never got to go to school. Like that's the problem. Like at least us like older, like youth people, like teenagers, we have social media, so we're still able to connect. But when it comes to the younger people, they're unable to connect, make friends. So the mental aspect is huge, and thank you for touching on that. Our next question is from Xavier to Professor Pond.
And the rest of the panelists can feel free to comment after Professor Pond answers. So, will we have like vaccine yearly or boosters? And if so, how does the virus change and mutate over time that makes it the vaccine not work?
That's a great question. So let me answer the second part of it first. So as I mentioned before, RNA viruses, because at the molecular level, they basically make mistakes when they copy themselves. They make billions upon billions of copies within a single individual, which means they will generate a lot of individual mutations. What makes the virus change is something called selective pressure, which means that the virus is, for example, being targeted by the immune system. And say there's one particular location in one of its proteins, say the spike protein, that is being targeted by the immune system. If a particular variant just happens to acquire a mutation there that makes it less susceptible to the neutralizing antibody, it will become more fit, which means it'll outcompete and outgrow other viruses. So that's very basic population genetics and evolutionary biology that applies to everything, including us. We just do it at a much, much slower scale than viruses. So once we have a selective pressure, it's basically a done deal, and an ongoing circulation that there's going to be viral evolution, because that's what pathogens have evolved over hundreds of millions of years to do. We did a very detailed study actually to look at what point we could detect that shift because of the wealth of molecular sequence data. And for the first 9 months of the pandemic until October 2020, the virus was basically circulating as it is. I mean, it made some small changes, but it wasn't really no new lineages were emerging. It was basically sort of more or less the same viruses entered the human population at the beginning of 2019, late 2019. And then what happened, you saw all these alpha lineages, beta lineages, gamma lineages, all arose at the end of 2020 through somewhat different means, but what basically drove them into, or created them, was increasing immune selective pressure from population. So, in Brazil and South Africa, enough people had been exposed to SARS-CoV-2 that instead of just infecting people that have no immunity to the virus, there was some immunity to the virus. And conceptually, you can sort of think of this in exactly the same way as you would think of developing drug resistance against bacteria. That's why they tell you to take antibiotics until the entire course. You have to kill it completely. If you don't completely kill the virus, if you let something outgrow, it can continue spreading. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the virus is going to become more deadly. In fact, counterintuitively, a lot of times what happens with these pathogens is they get into the human population through new hosts, and they actually evolve to be less pathogenic. The evolutionary goal of the virus is not to kill the host, it's to make more virus. And there are different adaptation strategies to do this. You can be more transmissible and less deadly, for example. So we don't actually know for sure which way the virus is going. So if you, next time you see a new lineage, ask yourself the question, why is it always presented that the new lineage is deterministically becoming more deadly? There's absolutely no evidence for this. That's all you'll see in the press, unfortunately, because bad news sells. But a lot of times what could actually be happening and that we don't know. I mean, new lineages will arise all the time. Now, because of this, it is very likely, and I think there's a growing scientific consensus, that we're going to have to sort of periodically update the composition of the vaccine to change according with what the virus is doing. There is a possibility, we've never done this before, but it is possible, and I think it would be a stunning, scientific achievement, definitely worthy of a Nobel Prize, if somebody develops a universal vaccine. This has sort of been the holy grail, where you don't just chase the variants that are now circulating or that you think they'll be, around, but you sort of design a vaccine that preemptively, stops everything that could happen. There are some indications that this might happen. I don't know when that will happen, and until then, the sort of past history indicates that we'll go through, periodic vaccination updates. It is hard to say at what rate it will happen. It's sort of a recurring theme that a number of panelists have mentioned. I would like you to keep that in mind, is that there are a number of competing priorities. So for example, today, I read that WHO recommended that people stop giving booster shots because there is a worldwide shortage of vaccines. I mean, many countries have no access to vaccines that we have access to, and we have a surplus. So you need to take this into consideration as well, because I mean, say you suppress the vaccine, you suppress circulation in the United States, but the virus doesn't care what the borders are. It's going to cross. If a new variant develops somewhere else, it's going to make its way into the United States. You really need to take this global perspective. So I would say, in my view, we are going to have, booster and updated vaccine formulations. It is too early to tell how frequently this will happen. But if you want sort of an intuition of what it is likely to look like, it's probably like the flu vaccine. So I would say annual updates is probably where it's going to go. If we develop a universal vaccine, then that'd be amazing. It'd actually be, you would also probably be able to do this for influenza. You'll probably be able to do this for a bunch of other sort of recalcitrant diseases that we haven't been able to fully suppress. So I think this might be sort of a paradigm shifting event in biomedical science.
Thank you, Professor Pond. Our next question will be from Anisha to Mr. Saunders.
Hi, Mr. Saunders. My question is, do you feel that people should be pressured to get vaccinated by restaurants/workplaces?
The short answer is no, and that's because there are those that have hesitancy to get the vaccine for so many different reasons, and to force them to have to get a vaccine in order to I don't know if it was come into a restaurant, I think is maybe short-sighted and an infringement upon their personal choices. Again, it's so difficult. People want to be safe. I think we all kind of anticipated being a little bit further along. We clearly did not anticipate this Delta variant, even though I guess professors like Dr. Pond probably did something along these lines. But I guess we anticipated being a little bit further along, but here we are. And we just need to, in my opinion, just do as much as we can to encourage people to get vaccinated. And in between, our mitigation strategies need to continue to be in place.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Now we'll be moving back to our audience questions. A question from Kennedy asking, how would you combat the ongoing battle of systemic discrimination and racial disparities within the medical field that some communities face? How do we ensure that all people, no matter what race you are, is receiving the proper care? And this can be to any panelist.
Well, I could take that one, and I actually have to head off for a 2:30 meeting shortly. So I'll jump in on that question. I feel pretty comfortable with that one. We are doing a fair amount of work in the anti-racism space within state government, working with a variety of different agencies across the Commonwealth. We had an anti-racism institute that about 220 people from 26 different state agencies participating in. We have an internal Department of Health, anti-racism and health equity task force that's developing an action plan and about to put that in front of our leadership to get them to sign off on it and to hopefully take action on it. And other agencies are doing the same thing. So clearly there's a benefit to doing this type of work. There's an intersection. If you look at some of the historical policies around redlining and the lack of investment in many minority communities, it has implications to health. If you are not as well resourced from an education perspective, chances are you're not going to get a great job that's going to put you in a position to get, to have good benefits and that give you access to care and all those good things, give you transportation to get to care, give you time off to seek care, all those things. So to do work in this space and chip away at some of those policies and practices that have impeded the health of many Pennsylvanians and many across the country and in fact the world, I think is a worthwhile endeavor and one in which we are partaking in. And again, many state agencies are as well, coming from their various purviews to impact this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Saunders. Another question from our attendees, Joshua Rhodes, is asking, do you have any advice for dealing with people who are aggressively anti-vaccinated? And any of the panelists can answer this again.
No, I think that I can certainly speak for some of that. I mean, we see patients, relatives, and so on, and relatives who accompany patients sometimes in healthcare settings. We see what I would call, I think that's what this question refers to, is those who are, for whatever reason, militantly against vaccines. And I think those people we typically do not like to engage, as in, this is not something that, this is like what I call one end of the bell-shaped curve, people who are absolutely vehemently opposed to the concept of vaccines, and we do not necessarily engage with them other than to always open up the dialogue about the why. But beyond that, as soon as it becomes abundantly clear pretty early in the interview that they don't want to go there, and we respect that space and we back off at that point, because there is no good way of that conversation ending, right? So on the other hand, there are many, many people who are appropriately and not unreasonably vaccine hesitant. Those are the people you want to engage. You do want to engage them with the best possible information, ask the why in an open-ended manner, and then attempt to address the why in a way that is credible, in a way that is dispassionate, in a way that doesn't pass judgment on who they are as people. And that's true of just about anything else that we do in healthcare. When people disagree with us on a treatment modality, a breast cancer patient who doesn't want to be treated in a certain way when that can save her life, for example, that may seem extraordinarily unreasonable to me as a man, right? But that may be very reasonable for that person who is living that situation and that. So it's the same thing. It's wearing the shoes of that person, and in a dispassionate way, engaging in a dialogue that's reasonable and that attempts to change the mind, and at that point, leaving it up to them to make a choice.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Our next question from the attendees is, in the light of slowing vaccination rates, should the United States give more vaccine incentives, or would that be considered unethical?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to one part of that, and certainly the issue of ethics is slightly less of an issue here. This has been studied in multiple forums and multiple ways, providing incentives to people to go through health interventions is a very, very commonly done thing. There have been multiple research lines that have been performed in the field of behavioral economics. For example, having people to stop smoking by paying them. Kevin Volt from the University of Pennsylvania has done a lot of this research on behavioral economics and incentives in the context of smoking cessation, for example, where he took 3 groups of people, one who were offered no incentives, one who were offered $160 incentive, and another third group who was offered a $400 incentive in smoking cessation. It was fascinating data that showed the $400 incentive worked the best. And well after the incentive would have worn off, and well after the time that you would think that the smoking habit would return, smoking cessation rate stayed high in the $400 incentive group, as an example. I'm using that as an example to illustrate that economic incentives have been attempted in multiple other public health interventions. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying that from the ethics of it, as long as there are appropriate safeguards in place, there are many places where that line can be crossed. But in a broad sense, I think, and as you know, I mean, the current presidential administration is considering those, and I don't think that's unreasonable.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi. Another question we have is from Mr. Onal. Is it technologically possible to implant an organism to manipulate people's actions and choices? And this can be to any of the panelists.
Not very knowledgeable about that one.
I mean, Elon Musk is trying his Neuralink, if that's what you mean, but I'm not aware of anything else otherwise.
You stumped us.
All right, well, our next question is from Aaron asking, is a universal vaccine even possible?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I posted some stuff for you to look at in the chat if you want to, but it's again, it goes back to HIV research, and let's see if I can explain it very simply. When the genetic sequence of the virus mutates, it looks bad, but what happens downstream of this, what really makes the virus work are proteins. So RNA has to be translated into proteins, and proteins evolve a lot more slowly. You can change the sequence of the virus a lot, and the protein is going to look very similar. I mean, people have done these things where they look at the structures of 2 influenza viruses that are from different, like H1N1 and H3N2. They haven't had anything in common evolutionarily for thousands of years, but their proteins look effectively the same. So, and proteins have to stay the same because they have to bind the human receptor, and the human receptor doesn't change much, for example. So what you can do is you can try to find, through a variety of techniques, parts of these viral proteins that the virus is simply not able to change. And what you try to do is you try to find 3 or 4 of them, right? The same way you do combination therapy, say in HIV or in cancer, where if you give one drug, the virus is going to be able to escape it because all it needs is 1 mutation. But if you give it, say, 4 drugs, that's how HIV was eventually controlled, with combination therapy of 3 drugs. The virus would need multiple mutations at the same time, which it simply can't do. So that's sort of the intuition behind it. And there are different technical approaches to trying to figure out which parts of the protein to target. Then there are technical challenges, how do you actually put it in a vaccine so the immune system develops what you want it to develop. But it's closer than it's ever been. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the next, say, 5 to 10 years, we have some fundamentally new technologies for dealing with diverse viral organisms. So it's not immediately available, but I think all the pieces are in place. And there's motivation to get it done, obviously. I mean, if you're not motivated by this pandemic, I don't know what else will motivate you.
Thank you, Professor Pond. Now to our final question, as this panel is almost done. And to all our panelists, what might be a lasting impact on our community and on our mental health if we have another long period of quarantine?
Well, I think we could, certainly see continued anxiety issues, exacerbated anxiety issues, and certainly the fatigue that we have seen throughout the, mitigation efforts to, try to calm this storm. But, for some people, they just kind of give up. They're tired of dealing with social distancing. They're tired of masking. And so, what that fatigue does then is it lessens the likelihood of following, further rules that will, ensure safety. Or it's, the analogy, the little boy who cried wolf, and people just become disinterested and then they're not paying attention. And then we have, bigger issues as well that happen. So, I certainly can see that psychologically happening for, a host of, mental health issues, as well as this just disregard for, knowledge that we already see to some degree.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Now, if any of the panelists have any questions to each other, you may ask it.
As a vice president of the organization, I wanted to really thank Dr. Joshi, that I know and I admire always. And Pond, of course, and Kichapudi and Dr. Brown, really appreciate it. We spend, sometimes during this summer with these students. They are very bright. They are very, of course, they have interesting ideas. And thank you to us spend, sometimes with, this intern today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. If I can just make one quick small comment at the end. So first of all, I think this is really an incredible event that you all have put together. So I really congratulate you for doing this. And for a lot of questions that you have asked us to respond, whether it is racial injustice or social media misinformation, I think the answer is that is in front of my screen here. So you, the young people who are the young leaders, you need to take this on as a mantle that going forward in your professional work, how you can then develop a society that is more inclusive and that is devoid of these biases, but more importantly, that embraces science and facts and not the conspiracies. So I'm encouraged by what I'm seeing, and I wish you all the best in whatever you do. And thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Speakers. And also, before you leave, Ariana wanted a follow-up question to Dr. Joshi. So Ariana, if you want to ask that before they all leave, then go ahead.
Oh, sure. Dr. Joshi, just a follow-up from the very first question I asked you about the vaccines, and you referenced a lot about the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. I was wondering if what you were saying still applied to Johnson & Johnson, since so many Americans have gotten that vaccine.
Yeah, so I think that Johnson & Johnson is also a highly effective vaccine. In the broad context of vaccines, it remains highly effective. When it gets, and the important distinction is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, as it relates to efficacy against symptomatic COVID, that might be somewhat less compared to Pfizer and Moderna, but its efficacy against life-threatening disease and hospitalization gets to be pretty high as well, very similar to the other vaccines, somewhat less, but pretty similar. So the point being that in concept, if you've gotten the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, that it retains pretty good efficacy for that, for that class of disease. That being said, there is some new data beginning to evolve, and I must admit that that's in its infancy, and I would love to see some more published in that area, and maybe Suresh even has more access to some more information. I do know that unpublished data, but that has found its way into, actually some of it is published in an abstract form as well, which is that against the Delta variant, the efficacy of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it's somewhat lower compared to the alpha and the other variants that are not the Delta variant. So that is cause for a little bit of trepidation and somewhat of a concern. From a side effect profile standpoint, honestly, I'm not worried. I think that the incidence of side effects remain just, very, very low. So those are the two caveats. Somewhat less effective against symptomatic disease across the board, and maybe evolving data that in the Delta, with the Delta variant, the J&J vaccine may have somewhat lower efficacy compared to Pfizer and Moderna.
Thank you for squeezing that last one in.
Sure.
If I may add one thing, I'll post it in the chat, but there is a large effort spearheaded by the NIH to provide pretty much real-time access to all the aggregated information we have in therapeutic efficacy. So they keep track of various clinical trials, and monoclonal antibodies. So I posted it there. You can explore it. It's basically the state of the art of the science as we know it. And I would encourage you, you should just go out, make use of all the primary data, make your own decisions, and just think critically about this. Don't trust what other people tell you, because there's no reason to. It's all out in the open, and you're smart, so make use of it.
Can I just also add, I can't really resist this. So there's a clear distinction that we have to make, that this data that is evolving, and as Professor Pond said, there is so much literature. And this is for people like us in the field to understand and continue to develop. So the vaccines are the first generation, and all the scientists across the world are working on the second generation vaccines. But the danger is sometimes if people who are not fully trained and takes this information out of context and try to compare, this vaccine is 95% or 93%, and that could create unnecessary confusion. So I think the clear message is that all the vaccines that are fully approved currently are very effective. It doesn't mean that that is the end of the story. So we are working on the second generation, third generation vaccines, and the science will continue. But in the meantime, the message is that the best vaccine is what you have access to. So, and not getting into this nitty-gritty of the efficacy, though that is for the scientists and the professors to worry about and continue to work on. And that should be the clear message we want to communicate to the public. Thank you.